We'll be hearing from a panel of telecom policy experts, and if anyone is an expert, they're going to be on this panel today because they know the ins and outs of all the issues at the FCC, particularly the wireless issues. There are a lot of competitive issues, as you know, on the horizon, and we'll be looking at a number of them through this panel. While everyone's getting mic'd up and come on up, I'll sort of keep setting it up here for Mr. Kirby, our moderator. And like I say, we'll talk about the issues on the horizon, the data roaming, effects on the auction decisions, maybe a little USF, and much more. And leading this discussion today will be Paul Kirby. Paul is the senior editor of TR Daily, who exclusively covers wireless issues. And Paul's very familiar with CCA's positions, everyone's policy positions, and we are delighted to have him join us here in Las Vegas and head up this panel. So Paul, I think you got everybody in their places, and I'm going to turn it over to you and let you introduce your panelists, and thank you one and all for the wireless advisors and the alleged Counsel of Great and Powerful House Energy and Commerce Committee. Welcome.
Thank you, Steve, and thanks for having us. I'll introduce our speakers, and then we'll ask them some questions, and near the end, we'll open it up for you all. Going down the line, we have Renee Gregory. She's the legal advisor to Chairman Wheeler. Then we have Erin McGrath. She's the legal advisor to Commissioner O'Reilly. We have Louis Peraertz. He's the legal advisor to Commissioner Clyburn, who you just heard from. Then we have Brendan Sasso. He's the legal advisor to Commissioner Pai. And at the end, we have, Brendan Carr. At the very end, yes, it was. He keeps on shaving, and then I'm not sure who he is. At the end, we have David Redl. David works for the House Energy and Commerce Committee. He works for the Subcommittee on Communications and Technology, as well as the full chairman of the committee, Mr. Upton. And he's going to talk about some of the issues related to Capitol Hill and how the Hill sees things. We'll start off talking about a popular topic here, and that's incentive auction. The FCC, of course, at this point hopes to start its auction in mid-2015. I want to get views from you all, whoever wants to answer, about what some of the key issues you think are for a successful auction, and whether you think the auction will start on time, because NAB, as folks know, has filed a legal challenge to the auction, to the incentive auction rules that were adopted in May. So we'll just go down the line, or if anyone in particular wants to answer that.
Started. Mic on? Can you all hear me? Okay, now we go. First of all, thank you all for coming out this morning bright and early. Thank you to Commissioner Clyburn for getting the day off to a good start. It's an exciting time to be in wireless, as all of you know, and it's an incredible opportunity for me to be able to work with the chairman and all of my colleagues here, and Commissioner Rosenworcel's staff as well, who couldn't be here this morning. But incentive auction clearly is one of the most exciting things going on in wireless. And yesterday was a big day for the incentive auction. The great staff back in DC circulated 4 items to the commissioners for their consideration as follow-ons to the report and order that the commission adopted last May. We have follow-up notices on Part 15 unlicensed rules in the TV band and the 600 megahertz band, as well as for wireless mics, which we all appreciate more when we're at conferences like this. And those 2 are slated for the September open meeting. We also circulated a notice about low-power television. Clearly, there's going to be less room for everyone in the band after the auction, so we want to make sure that we do what we can to make sure that their content reaches their viewers. And finally, last but certainly not least, we circulated an order and a notice on aggregate interference and inter-service interference. With the market variation that will result most likely from the incentive auction, we need to make sure that there isn't interference between broadcasters and wireless carriers who are maybe operating right next to each other in the spectrum. So it's going to be a big month. I hope all of my colleagues are buckled up and ready to tackle some complicated issues, and hope all of you will also be engaging on those in the coming weeks and the coming month as well, to order on some of those. In terms of the success of the auction, I think everyone agrees that broadcaster participation is going to be incredibly important. Without broadcasters coming to the table to give up some or all of their spectrum rights, there's no spectrum for the commission to repack. There's no spectrum licenses for us to auction to all of you in the forward auction. So we are going to be working very hard in parallel with the policy and technical rules that we still need to finalize to make sure that broadcasters are aware of not only the process for the auction, but also the economic opportunities that it represents. And very soon we will be coming out with additional information on those topics, including potential opening bids for broadcasters. Clearly, dollar signs and zeros make people sit up and take notice. So hopefully the information that we're coming out with soon will do that very thing. With respect to timing, we are working very hard still towards a mid-2015 auction. Gary Epstein, Howard Simons, and staff from across the Commission's bureaus and offices are doing incredible work. The fact that there are 4 items that were circulated yesterday, just a few short months after the report and order, speaks to the hard work and the dedication of everyone moving forward. But of course, whenever you have litigation, it introduces some risk, some complexity, some uncertainty that I'm sure we'll all have to continue to grapple with in the months ahead. Sorry for the very long answer.
No, that's fine. And in fact, I was going to ask about those 4 items. I know all the legal advisors have read all the items, really, from the beginning to the end. For those of you not familiar with the FCC, when items circulate to the Commissioner's offices, they circulate very early in the day, and it gives them the whole day to read them, so they will probably share copies of those items with us. Does anyone else want to comment? I'm not going to ask you to comment on them specifically, but just the fact that they're trying to maintain, if you will, the schedule for these follow-up items. The Commission had said that third quarter was their timeline for moving on these as far as circulation. Anyone else want to offer any opinions?
I'll go.
Sure.
My boss has been very outspoken that he would like the auction to happen as quickly as possible. However, he doesn't feel that we should take speed over ensuring a successful auction. So his number one goal is that we meet the targets that we need to under the statute. So yes, broadcaster participation, number one thing. We don't have an auction without that spectrum. But we also have to ensure that we hit our revenue targets. So, we're going to use the money to obviously pay off the broadcasters for handing over their spectrum, but we also, need money for FirstNet and deficit reduction. So, the amount, this is one of those only auctions that I know of where we have goals to meet that are more than just allocating spectrum. So he wants to make sure that this auction is as successful as possible. So that is his first goal. And as Renee went through the huge number of items that are now before us, as you said, what are some of the things that can delay the auction? We have to finish all those proceedings. We have to take into consideration your valuable comments and then come up with orders, fill in the details to the framework that we put out already in the order. So, and as Paul recognized, NAB has already filed one legal challenge. So you can also have future PFRs filed, petition for recon. We could have legal challenges. So all of these need to be wrapped up so that we ensure the best opportunity for success.
Louis?
Yep. As my colleagues have noted, there's already a litigation, there's a Court of Appeals challenge, and there could be other circumstances outside of the Commission's staff's control with regard to meeting this mid-2015 target date. Commissioner Clyburn feels, however, that setting a target date was important because it gets all relevant stakeholders focused and planning on a near-term solution to all of the issues, all of the technical issues that need to be resolved before we can adopt rules and hold the successful auction. Since early 2012, the Commission staff has been working diligently and appropriately to address the important concerns of both broadcasters, wireless carriers, folks who are trying to develop business models using TV white spaces, wireless microphone users, as well as hospital medical care providers that are using wireless medical telemetry services. When she was acting chair, she got a chance to see up close and personal the level of dedication of the staff to this process and she feels confident that the staff will continue to work diligently and to, with this purpose in mind in terms of addressing important concerns by everyone. In terms of what is a successful auction, in addition to broadcaster participation, we also feel that, she also feels that participation by wireless carriers is also important. Chairman Wheeler yesterday in his remarks stated how important that was. And it's important, and he talked about the AT&T interest, Dish's interest, as well as T-Mobile's report. But what's also important is smaller carrier participation. And that's why Commissioner Clyburn was so supportive of, in the AWS-3 auction, cellular market areas, blocks of those, and then in the incentive auction, partial economic areas that were promoted by both CCA and others in the industry.
Okay.
Sure, I'll jump in as well. Thanks, Paul, for moderating. Thanks, CCA, for having us all out here. I think Steve and his group are doing a really wonderful job in DC representing the interests of the association. And in terms of some of the obstacles for the incentive auction, I think, again, thanks to CCA, I think there's some things that aren't sort of on the table anymore. I think, as Louis mentioned, the PEAs, CCA did a great job sort of running that to ground, getting that in the record. I think the order really benefited from their work on that. I will say on the litigation, I do think that's the biggest threat right now to the timing of the auction. The court schedule that came out last week puts oral argument likely in early 2015 at the soonest. I think if the commission loses that case, obviously that's going to put the timeline in jeopardy. And regardless, there's going to be a cloud of uncertainty for a little while hanging over it, which could dampen participation. So I think yesterday Commissioner Pai expressed his hope that the parties could come together and reach a settlement, and I think that's the right path forward. And then, there are sort of technical issues that we need to resolve still. Some of the interference issues, some of the operations and the duplex gaps. I think it's important to remember, too, that it is an incentive auction. If we get those things right, if we get our rules right, if the framework is right, that's going to be the incentive to draw people on both sides of the equation to the commission. If we don't get it right, there's really no amount of arm twisting we can do to get people to show up, but I'm hopeful that we can get those things across the finish line.
Okay. David, do you want to give us a sense of how your bosses?
Sure, and I don't think I can add much more to some of the more granular issues that all of my colleagues up here spoke about ahead of time, but I will touch on some of the things that were said about deadlines, which Louis mentioned that Commissioner Clyburn is a supporter of having a deadline in place to motivate folks to get further along in the process, and certainly anybody that read the communications provisions of the Middle Class Tax Relief Act knows that Congress wasn't shy about putting deadlines in for just that purpose. But to talk a little bit about what Erin said about Commissioner O'Reilly's stance as well, for this particular auction, we gave the full 10-year auction window. And there was a reason for that, and that's because we are strongly in support of having as many participants in the auction as possible. For the wireless industry, that's not a problem in reality. I mean, the wireless industry are savvy veterans of the auction process. You all know how it works. You know how a forward auction goes forward. You know how to look at these auctions and take the rules into account and figure out the best business case for your individual circumstances. The broadcasters, on the other hand, have never been in this circumstance. And so I think that the NAB and certainly Preston Padden on behalf of his clients has laid out some of the real concerns that broadcasters have, both those that want to stay in the business of broadcasting and those that want to sell and get out of the business of broadcasting and turn their licenses in. And the sooner we can clear those question marks, the sooner we can tell broadcasters, yes, we've figured out border coordination. Yes, we've figured out how to ensure that your coverage areas will be taken care of. Yes, we've figured out how we're going to deal with the relocation expenses that you're going to have if you're staying on the air. I think the faster we'll be able to get to the actual business of doing the auction. So I'm hopeful that the commission will continue working as they have been to clear those issues, and certainly Renee highlighted all of them very well, the issues that we all have to look at going forward. And my bosses are very hopeful that they'll clear up those broadcasting issues and we can get down to brass tacks.
Now, there are some recon petitions filed in response to the incentive auction. Well, actually, it's a spectrum holdings order, which is related to the incentive auction. T-Mobile has asked that a greater amount of spectrum be reserved for carriers with less sub 1 gigahertz spectrum. Sprint said, can you reconsider your decision to not weight spectrum depending upon where the spectrum is, with lower band spectrum being counted higher? In particular, the T-Mobile petition, does anyone want to weigh in on that or give any opinions on that, realizing it's still before the commission, and so if not, that's peachy. No? Okay. Let's move on. Yes,
Well,
Louis.
all I'll say is that, in her concurring statement with regard to the mobile spectrum holdings order, the commissioner made quite clear that she would have preferred the original proposal that was circulated, if only 60 megahertz or 50 megahertz of spectrum was recovered. We preferred the 30-20 and I believe it's 40-20 and 30-20 split that was originally 30-30 and 30-30 and 30-20 split that was originally circulated by Chairman Wheeler. This proposal in the petition for reconsideration is different because it's asking for more than half of the spectrum that is recovered under any scenario. It's very early in the pleading process. My understanding from the staff is that the petition for reconsideration was just put out in the Federal Register. I believe it was either yesterday or a couple of days ago. And so it's going to be a while before the record closes on that and we can consider it.
Now, Louis mentioned earlier the AWS-3 auction. We're expecting that to start at this point, November 13. I wanted to get a sense of any of you, what makes a successful AWS-3 auction? Obviously, as folks have mentioned, there are revenue targets and revenue decisions that the FCC needs to raise, including FirstNet, including some other priorities. The issues, AWS-3 is a little different, as folks in the audience I'm sure know, because this spectrum is currently being used by the federal government, so there are a lot of questions about how that spectrum can be shared, either transitionally before the federal agencies move to other spectrum or in the longer term. So first of all, I wanted to get your views. What makes a successful AWS-3 auction? Obviously, there's a reserve price that would have to be met, but then longer term as far as sharing, and I know the Hill's been very interested in this topic. If any of you want to weigh in on that.
I'll start,
Sure.
if that's all right with everybody. You're absolutely right, Paul. The Hill has been very active on this, and this comes back in many ways to what Louis mentioned about Commissioner Clyburn's thoughts on deadlines. We put in a deadline for the 2.1 gigahertz portion of this spectrum for a reason. People needed to be motivated, and combine that with the fact that both the chairman, my boss, Mr. Upton, and the ranking member, Mr. Waxman, both took a particular interest in making sure that the 1755 pairing for this came to fruition. I think the monthly meetings that Sean Chang, my counterpart, and I had with NTIA and FCC and DoD have gotten us to a point where, it put the FCC in a position to meet the deadline. And we're really happy to see that it looks like that's going to happen. It wasn't easy going to get there. There's been a lot of back and forth about what appropriate exclusion zones would look like, how the sharing would be achieved with the Department of Defense and others, frankly. But we're on the cusp of having an auction and having this spectrum operationalized, and it's been a long time coming. So we're really hopeful that this will get done. We're excited about the idea that it looks like it's going to get done, and we're keeping our fingers crossed for a successful auction.
More broadly, David, is there anything you want to say about in the last couple of years, in the last year or two in particular, the industry and the agencies, DoD and others, have worked really more collaboratively, if you will, to try to work on ways to free up spectrum. Is the hope the House Energy and Commerce Committee has, basically it's a working group to look at government spectrum. Is there a hope that this can be more of a template going forward for other bands, do you think?
Absolutely. I mean, this was, frankly, this is proof of concept that you can sit everybody down and make it happen. 1755 to 1780 had been part of the original discussion of the AWS-1 band in the late 90s and then up through the auction in the mid-2000s. So for us to see it now come to fruition, I think is a template for how to work moving forward. I don't think I can say enough good things on behalf of my bosses about how productive the meetings with FCC and NTIA and DoD were. Everyone came prepared to work, prepared to roll up their sleeves and get down to doing it. And now that we are where we are, yeah, we're hopeful this will be a template going forward for how to get the private sector, who was a big part of the discussions, and the government agencies that are looking to transition into the same room and get it done. Yeah, we very much view it that way.
And I know, Lou, your boss mentioned a short time ago the need for collaboration and the need to look, and she mentioned this yesterday at CTIA, to look at sharing as a solution.
Yeah, Commissioner Clyburn actually, from very early in her tenure, has been a very strong proponent of the notion that it's an all of the above approach. That's why she talks not just about repurposing, but also for the spectrum that is already currently allocated, more efficient uses of that spectrum. But I just wanted to concur with Dave for a second with regard to the efforts by NTIA, DoD, working collaboratively with the FCC to really make this possible, make the AWS-3 auction possible. While she was acting chair, our office worked a lot with the principal staffers in NTIA. That allowed me to work with a former colleague of mine, Peter Tenhula, who was a wireless advisor for Chairman Powell when I first started at the FCC. And I mean, the efforts of Peter and Carl Nebbia and a whole other people in NTIA, Fred Moorfield and DoD, I mean, were just really terrific. And it's that type of it's that type of interest and dedication to both ensuring that federal agencies have the spectrum that they need for their missions, but that we can really have a successful auction to meet the commercial needs of wireless consumers. So that's one of the reasons why we think, Commissioner Clyburn thinks that going forward, this could be a very productive template.
Okay. Yeah.
This is a continuous learning process. We started with AWS-1. Easier fact scenario there, but we used that experience to go to AWS-3. And when you realize how far it has come, even between the time that we had the original order, the protection zones were much larger at that point. And during just the time between releasing the information and the order, we got the protection zones down. We now have the information out there about relocation, and hopefully that trend will continue. I mean, just because we have a certain amount of information out there, hopefully industry and the federal agencies will be able to come together and say, look, how can we make those protection zones even smaller? Not only before the auction, but after the auction happens, how can we help the federal government to get out of the bands that we want? I mean, as everybody knows here, sharing is not easy. It's going to be continuously a challenge for us, because yes, we are going to continuously move people off of bands that are currently held by other, by the federal government, or depending upon how far we go with this, we could try to reallocate other spectrum, but we're going to have to come up with the way to move and to keep this process going so that we learn from our lessons. And the next auction, when we do this, hopefully protection zones will be that much smaller and we'll be able to move faster. But it's a learning process as we go along. So my boss is very optimistic that this will be a successful auction and will raise as much money as it possibly can.
And your boss yesterday also specifically said that there's a need to really hold the agency's feet to the fire, if you will. Mm-hmm. And Commissioner Rosenworcel talked about incentives for agencies, and he said, yeah, those are good, but you also need to really kind of push to get that spectrum, because the issue of getting federal spectrum has been going on really for many, many years. As folks said, around 9/11, folks were looking at trying to free up some spectrum for AWS-1, and some was freed up, but the rest was not, because of some security concerns, and national security and DoD kind of had a little more clout after that.
Paul, I would like to add one other thing. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that one of the things that I think it's one of the unsung portions of the middle class tax relief act that really was particularly helpful in AWS-3 are the changes that were made to the Commercial Spectrum Enhancement Act. We learned a lot about how this worked in AWS-1, about the challenges of asking agencies to make plans without money on the assumption that they'll get it later on in the process. And so there were a number of changes made to how planning money could be made available to make these sorts of things happen. And it was one of those bipartisan issues that was very early in the process agreed to, that this was something that would really facilitate making more government spectrum available for commercial auction. We're really happy to see that it's having the effect we intended. And speaking of incentives, I would also be remiss if I didn't note that we also passed bipartisanly the Federal Spectrum Incentive Act out of our committee in a way, looking for ways to apply the incentive auction mechanisms to the federal government. So we're also focused in that space as well.
Yes.
Quickly follow up to what you said. I mean, holding people's feet to the fire. I mean, one of the important things to take away from that is that we should always look at clearing over sharing. Sharing does work in many contexts, but of course, as always, the optimal way to go is clearing. So I just want to make that obviously clear, that no pun intended, that the easiest way to not run into the delays with trying to get protection zones down is to clear the spectrum and agree that we're going to clear the spectrum from the get-go.
Now, proposals to allow agencies to share in auction revenues as an incentive, that would require legislation. David, can you give us any sense for whether that would be supported by your bosses or considered by your bosses, or is that does that run counter to holding agencies' feet to the fire?
Well, we've moved it out of the committee. So we've moved the Federal Spectrum Incentive Act out of the committee.
Now the
my
question
bosses,
is,
bipartisanly,
Yeah.
it was voice voted out of committee. So
as far as the full House, is there any hope as far as getting, well, no, I'm not saying it.
Just generally. Is
I
that
didn't mean to have a tone or anything there. What I'm saying is,
Can you get it done, Redl?
do you have a sense for the prospects? Let's ask it that way.
So at this point in the congressional calendar, I'm not sure what the prospects are for this Congress. But the fact that we moved it unanimously out of committee, I think says a lot about the committee's emphasis on making government spectrum better used, more efficient, and make it available for more commercial uses. So I'm optimistic that as we go into the ComAct update process in the next Congress, that we'll continue to be looking at things like incentives for federal agencies.
Okay. Another issue, in August, the FCC circulated to commissioners an NPRM that tentatively concluded that there should not be joint bidding arrangements between the 4 national carriers. That, of course, would be of interest to the smaller carriers. I wanted to see, the item also, by the way, proposed to get rid of a rule that would basically attribute to carriers the revenues of people that they might have partnerships with and lease spectrum to. If they didn't really have a business arrangement or the other company doesn't have control of that company. I wanted to see, realizing this item is on circulation, if anyone wants to weigh in initially on this.
I'll weigh in. Clearly, it's still under discussion among the commissioners right now, so I'll keep it at a pretty high level. The chairman thought it was important to revisit the whole issue of our competitive bidding rules. It's been a long time since the commission looked at the rules, and the wireless industry has changed tremendously since that time in terms of the business models and the players and the evolution of technology. So going into the incentive auction in particular, we wanted to make sure that everyone had certainty about what the rules would be and to try to take steps to further encourage more competition and more participation by smaller entities in the wireless ecosystem. And looking at the AMR rule in particular, the chairman would like to give companies more flexibility to use spectrum that has been acquired with bidding credits. The fact of the matter is that today, standing up a facilities-based wireless company is very hard given the capital requirements. So if we can find a way to enable some on-ramps and allow companies that have won spectrum licenses with bidding credits to have the same flexibility and the lack of regulation over how they use their spectrum, he thinks that's a good thing. He also thinks it's a good thing to revisit our thresholds for bidding credits, which have not changed in many, many years. And so we're looking at potentially changing them just to look at inflation. So anything that we can do to encourage competition, to meet our statutory mandates, to make sure that we are having opportunities for providers of all sizes to participate in our auctions, to participate in the wireless ecosystem, he thinks that's incredibly important. And we're hopeful that soon everyone will be able to look at the notice and give their feedback to the chairman as well as all of the other commissioners as we look to have orders in place well in advance of the incentive auction.
On the, Commissioner Clyburn mentioned the mobility fund. That obviously is an issue of importance to the members here. Does anyone else want to weigh in on kind of how the FCC should approach what the size of the fund should be? There are a lot of issues about whether you give support to areas that where there's no one else that can serve it, or someone, a telco might be able to serve it, but the wireless folks can serve it better. Does anyone else want to weigh in on how the FCC should approach that? No? Okay. So looking at 911 services, the FCC has been very busy in recent months on 911. It's been a hot topic, including text to 911, indoor location accuracy. I guess I just want to see, sort of generally, if our panelists want to either reflect on what the FCC's done or should do. I know some of the commissioners have been pretty vocal on on whether some of the proposals and rules, whether it's technically viable on both text to 911 and indoor location accuracy mandates.
I'll start.
Sure.
On the text to 911. It's quite simply this. More than 40 million of Americans have speech and hearing disabilities, which means that in an emergency, without text to 911, they can make a phone call, but they can't explain very clearly what the particulars of their emergency is and what kind of help they need. And this is why Commissioner Clyburn, when she saw that there was movement in the industry towards companies using SMS protocol riding over the wireless carriers' SMS networks, when she saw that was gaining traction, a lot of that has to do with, and we need to compliment the large 4 nationwide carriers who, through a voluntary solution, set a target date of May 15, 2014, to have that achieved throughout their networks to any PSAPs that were text 911 capable. But building on that momentum, she also thought it was important that the Commission move forward with regard to a notice of proposed rulemaking and adopt an order making clear that text to 911 requirements also apply to over-the-top service providers, over-the-top companies, and all wireless carriers.
Now, I know Erin and Brendan, your bosses had expressed some concerns about whether in indoor location accuracy, whether some of the proposals were technically viable. And 911 is an issue I'm sure as a lot of the people out here know. There's always been an issue for many, many years about whether there should be mandates and whether the mandates should just be down high, 2 years, 5 years, whatever, and whether vendors can be believed. Some carriers will say vendors will basically promise you the moon, but can they deliver that? Can they deliver what a mandate requires? Is there anything you all want to say about what your bosses have said on that? Or?
Sure. And you can take text 911 and location accuracy together because they're both based on new technologies, and at this point, technologies that haven't been proven. So just having one manufacturer who says they're close to meeting the goals that the Commission would like is not really sufficient to base regulations on. So my boss's take on, generally both of these items collectively is that, of course, and I don't think anyone's boss would debate this, is that, yes, emergency communications are of utmost importance, and we all support good, reliable communications systems. But the question is, when do you regulate? So my boss wanted to make sure that the technology was readily available and was reliable and that we know that it's going to work. Additionally, he wanted to make sure that we don't start a bad precedent of going to industry and saying, hey, help us out, help us solve this problem, help us get emergency communications better, have them set forth in a certain direction, and then turn around and say, thank you for your good work, we're now going to regulate you based on what you've done. Our first response to that was, well, why would anyone play this game again? If they're going to end up being regulated no matter what they do, why would they take the steps to assist us in solving our problems? So we had some concerns about that. We also were concerned about the fact that, especially in the context of text 911 and location accuracy, even if we have the communication systems, the PSAPs cannot actually accept text to 911 in most cases. Only 2% of the PSAPs can accept text to 911. We're not exactly sure what will happen with location accuracy at this point. So one of our overarching concerns was, well, how do you handle consumer expectation? Immediately after our text to 911 meeting, one of the first articles we saw was FCC mandates text to 911 for all. But if everybody sends a text to 911, most places it's not going to go through. You're going to get a bounce back. So we have to make sure that consumers are fully aware of what their options are and what the drawbacks are to doing text to 911 and knowing about the location accuracy issues.
Yeah, I would just reiterate that. Obviously, I mean, everyone at the commission, shares the common goal of promoting safety of life, and everyone across the board takes it very seriously. I think on some of the votes, you've seen, some disagreement about the best way to get there. And I think on Text 911, for instance, Commissioner Pai's view was he was concerned about, again, sort of the messaging of it would lead to consumer confusion. Less than 2% of the PSAPs accepting text messages. Countless situations in which you wouldn't even get a bounce back. And then also, everyone is attempting to be focused on the transition to NG911, which is IP-based. It's real-time, it's reliable, text communications with PSAPs, and the record was showing that going forward with the approach the commission was using, which was based on legacy SMS technology, was actually going to impede the NG911 transition. So he was concerned about both of those things. But text 911 and location accuracy, I think, his position is we need to be aggressive and achievable. Should be the guidepost for those.
Renee, you're the chairman in particular. Folks talked about PSAP readiness. The FCC doesn't have authority over PSAPs, and PSAP funding largely comes from states, sometimes from localities, and the FCC doesn't really have authority over that. And so he talked about in January, actually, in the text 911 proceeding, he talked about PSAPs stepping up. The others have stepped up, now you have to step up. Is there anything you want to, I guess, elaborate on his challenge, if we will, to PSAPs?
Sure, and just at a high level, 911 is so important, and the chairman has been very clear that when we're looking at networks across the board, whether it's wireless or wireline, people's ability to dial 911 in an emergency, to reach someone at a PSAP, and for that person to be able to know where they are, is one of the most fundamental responsibilities of the Commission under the Communications Act, making sure that that emergency communication is there. So he has used his bully pulpit with respect to PSAPs, stepping up to receive text. He's going to continue to use his bully pulpit with you all. I'm sure he very much wants to see industry step up and thinks it's great that the 4 nationwide carriers did step up to text 911. Unfortunately, and I am looking at you all, not everyone got on board, so he felt that we needed to move forward with some regulation. But he's going to continue to press this with his bully pulpit, trying to get industry to step up, and in the absence of that, I would expect that he'd continue to look for ways to guarantee that people will have the 911 capabilities that they expect. And in today's world, with people my generation and younger, they don't pick up a landline and call 911. They have their mobile phone, and even now they expect they should be able to text 911. It's a generational thing, and so we all need to meet that challenge of the expectation of the consumers who expect that they can make a call, that emergency responders will be able to receive the communication, whatever form it comes across, and that they will be able to be located no matter where they are. And that's a challenge that he's put out to all of you, he's put out to the PSAPs, and I expect he will continue to make that a high priority.
The roaming is a big issue for folks here. It was mentioned this morning, T-Mobile has a petition asking the FCC to give some guidance on what's commercially reasonable in a data roaming agreement. Does anyone else want to weigh in on that or give any opinions on that, realizing the petition is still out there?
Well, the record just closed on the 20th of August, but Roger Sherman and his team in the Wireless Bureau have made this very high priority to look very hard at the issues, to look very hard at the record and the comments that we've received. And the chairman has made it clear that this is a very high priority for him to figure out what, if anything, we should be doing. So I expect this to remain high on the Wireless Bureau's priority list, high on the chairman's list to figure out where we go. It's too early to say right now what we would do. I mean, the chairman had a few comments when he was talking to Steve the other morning, but this is something that we are looking at very closely.
Okay. The Hill, as David mentioned earlier, the Hill is going to be looking, the House Energy and Commerce Committee, at an update of the Telecommunications Act. They've had a series of white papers, to prime various issues. Can you give us any more, elaborate, David, for us on what you see going forward and what time frame you are hoping in terms of your work.
Sure. I mean, we have a paper out right now, a white paper that responses are due back on Friday. I'm sure on an issue a number of you, I'm sure, are interested in on the Universal Service Fund. We intend to continue in the rest of the year to do a few more white papers. There are issues that we still haven't addressed that we would like to use this process to information gather from industry, notably one of them being video. We were focused in the video space on getting Stella passed, which we were happy to get through the House. And now we're turning our attention on the COM Act update process to those issues as well. The chairman has told us, this would be a multi-year process, as a practical matter. We're looking to try and do this, next Congress. We've spent this year doing information gathering. We spent a lot of time on the white papers, and as the congressional calendar gets smaller and smaller, we're going to be spending a lot of staff time doing outreach to industries. So meeting with folks like Steve and his crowd over at CCA is very effective advocates for your industry, and having them bring folks in who can talk to us and say, these are the things we think are real challenges with the Communications Act. These are things that are holding us back. These are things we think we could do better. And we're going to use the rest of the year to finish up that process. We're really hoping to start off next Congress once we know who our dance partners will be. One of the challenges we face on both sides of the dome is that the Democrats in charge of the Commerce Committees, the ranking member on our side and the chairman on the Senate side, are both retiring. And so it's unclear at this point who will be our dance partner for this negotiation. We'd really like to get down to...
You can tell us who you prefer, and we'll just keep it in this room.
No. We're really hoping to get down to that once the election's over and the new Congress is seated, really putting pen to paper and getting moving on this. It's going to be a priority for the committee. There's a handful of priorities for Chairman Upton. This is one of the larger initiatives we're working on, and along with his 21st Century Cures and his Architecture of Abundance, energy and health initiatives, these are going to be the focus of the committee for the next 2 years. So we know it's an ambitious undertaking, but you got to start somewhere, and we think it's time for us to take a comprehensive look at the Act.
One thing about the white papers is interesting. In Washington, you'll see white papers sometimes that will be 50 pages, and you'll read it at night when you can't sleep. Your white papers are very short. Some are 3, 4, 5, 6 pages. They have 14, 15, 18, 20 questions with a lot of bullet points. Was that purposeful to kind of just get to the points, ask some specific questions, but open-ended and just kind of let people weigh in?
Yeah, it was very intentional. And I think actually the FCC's process is sort of instructive as to how we looked at this as well, because as we all know, when you look at an FCC docket, you get some very detailed, very comprehensive responses, and you get some very not detailed, very not comprehensive responses. We wanted to get everybody weighing in. And so we really went out of our way to try to structure the questions in a way that we ask broad thematic questions that will allow folks that want to take a broad thematic answer and give us that back. And for those of you that are in the weeds on the issues, they're also broad enough that it'll allow you to dig in on the issues you really care about and let us know what the real nitty-gritty, down-in-the-weeds issue that we should be paying attention to is. And we've been very pleased with the responses we've gotten. We've gotten the wide range we had hoped for. We've gotten responses from folks who just want to talk in 1 or 2 pages about what they think the principles we should look at are, and we've gotten 60-page economic analyses of why we should scrap certain portions of the Act. Those are all really helpful to us, and we're really happy to have gotten such a broad range and scope. We've gotten responses from folks we never expected to get. We've gotten a lot of international response, which has been surprising. In our first paper, the London School of Economics weighed in on the themes we should be looking at as we look at Communications Act reform. That's, as it turns out, the London School of Economics is not the usual folks who come in and lobby the Energy and Commerce Committee. So it's nice to get sort of a broad feedback and be able to aggregate all that together, not just for the committee staff who are sort of pulling all these together, but we've got to work with our member staffs and with the members themselves to really get these issues squared up and get ready starting in January to work hard on these.
Perhaps your outreach to them, the London School of Economics, can be in London. You can just go there. And,
Yeah, it'd be nice. I'm not sure that's going to fly. I'm not sure that's in the budget, but.
Now, how many, I wrote about some of the white paper's responses, and one there was like 79. Do you know the total number of comments you got, and realizing there might be overlap as the same parties respond to?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the same parties have responded, and many of them are in the room, to a number of papers. And Not surprisingly, and this is somewhat by design, we've gotten fewer responses each time,
Right.
but we've also been getting more granular. We started off with themes for a Communications Act update, and the last one was on universal service. So, you ask, as you all know, you ask most people what the Universal Service Fund is, and if they're not in the industry, they have no idea. And so, by design, they're getting more and more streamlined. We had 114 responses, I believe, to the first paper.
Okay.
And I think the most recent one before that, we had something like 60 responses. So it's been a pretty sustained effort by folks to weigh in and give us the information that we're looking for. We're really happy with it.
Do you have any, realizing this is a question you probably don't want to answer, but I'll ask it. Is there any review you have of Chairman Wheeler's tenure so far since he came to the commission?
I mean, it would be speaking out of school for me to give up the results of our fantasy FCC draft. But other than to say that I took Commissioner Pye with my first round pick. But no, I mean, the reality is we are obviously paying as close attention to what Chairman Wheeler is doing as we did Chairman Janikowski before him. The FCC is a place that is very driven by the personality of the chairman, and it's frankly pretty early into Chairman Wheeler's tenure. So we are very hopeful based on things he said and the fact that Diane Cornell was brought in to do a review of process that, as many of you know, Chairman Walden is very, very, very interested in the FCC's process and making it more transparent and predictable. And we are hopeful that the things that Ms. Cornell identified in her report will be implemented at the FCC. And I'm certainly not going to speak to, I'm sure Renee could speak more to sort of how that's going. But no, we, as it turns out, we don't rank them. We just move along.
Okay. Maybe U.S. News will rank them or something.
Yeah, there you go.
Best hospitals and FCC chairman. We're going to open it up to see if there's questions. I have more, but I want to give folks out there an opportunity. We have a microphone that is going around somewhere.
Except for Howard, don't give him the mic.
Except for Howard. Okay, so there's a question. So Lucy's going to bring you a mic, and then you can ask your question.
All right. Usually I talk about the distribution side of USF.
And if you could identify yourself just to...
Sure. I'm Julia Tanner. I'm a Vice President and General Counsel at MTPCS, which is a family of Cellular One companies. And usually I'm interested in the distribution side of USF, but I noticed you all studiously avoided that question, so I'm not going to go there. But I did have a question about contributions. As you all probably know, due to Title II exemption, many carriers assert that broadband customers are exempt from contributing to USF. And as a result, as all of us move more and more towards broadband, I have a feeling that the fund is going to shrink precipitously if the commission allows that to happen. And so I'm wondering, what do you all think is the timing on reform of the contribution side?
Sorry, we have to look to the chairman's office.
And I'm
Sorry to throw you under a bus.
No,
but-
that's good. And I need to punt because that's an area that unfortunately or fortunately is not under me. There's a Daniel Alvarez in our office is taking the lead on USF issues, so apologize, but can't give you any specifics.
That's unfortunate. Does anyone else have any ideas? No, I know you'd be closest to it, so. All right. Well, thank you.
David, when do you think Chairman Upton wants them to deal with the contribution? Oh, never mind. Does anyone else have questions? Okay, thank you.
I'm Paul Kirby, Telecommunications Reports.
Next.
I thought you were going to mute him. That's what you told me
I
before.
was going to mute him. I would like to mute him just going
Hey,
forward.
during one of my panels yesterday, I asked Paul if he had any questions. So
This is Howard Buskirk with
we played the
Communications
rule by
Daily,
the
which
rules
is
at Communications Daily.
at one time they were a trade publication.
Howard Buskirk,
I don't know.
Communications Daily, the publication that plays by the rules. I wanted to,
I don't even know what that means, but okay.
since I thought I'd try to spice things up a little bit since it's day 3 of this conference and everybody's probably tired of hearing policy discussions at this point. One of the big things that there was a lot of talk yesterday at this conference, but also at the conference that's happening down the street about Chairman Wheeler's comments on net neutrality And some people were reading those as an indication that it's all but a done deal, that the FCC is headed toward regulating net neutrality or wireless very similarly to how wireline is regulated under the net neutrality rules. And I don't know if any of you can comment on that, but I can just tell you that was something that everybody was talking about yesterday. Thanks.
I'll briefly comment on that. The chairman said what he said. You all can read the prepared remarks. And part of what he said is we're still evaluating the record. We have roundtables coming up. We have reply comments due in a few days. And he, along with everyone else, is going to have a lot of issues to grapple with over the coming months. But I don't think people should read more into his speech than the words on the page.
And I'll just say that Commissioner Clyburn, 4 years ago when the Open Internet Order was adopted, she expressed some concerns with how that order ended up, and most relevant here, she would have preferred parity of mobile services with regard to, with the rules that we adopted for fixed services. And she views the 2014 decision by the Court of Appeals as a unique opportunity for the Commission to take a look at the developments since 2010 to now, to see what kind of, how the wireless industry has grown. And you know, I think it was pretty interesting yesterday morning how many people said from from major wireless carriers, nationwide wireless carriers, to Chairman Wheeler that, a lot of folks are saying that this is a mobile-first world now. And that's something to think about in terms of reevaluating whether mobile services should be on parity with regard to fixed services for the purposes of open internet. Commissioner Clyburn really cares an awful lot about wireless carriers having the ability to reasonably manage their networks. So she's going to keep an open mind about all of this stuff, but she really does think it's time to reevaluate how the mobile industry has grown and its importance. And she's also looking again at the fact that each year, as she mentioned this morning, each year the number of folks who are cutting the cord and relying only on wireless service for their communication needs is growing. And for those under the poverty line, it's now hovering around 56%.
I'll just add, Commissioner Pai's view is that in the context of any policy debate, we need to remain cognizant of the differences, the technical differences between different types of networks. And wireless and wireline are different. And we can't gloss over those distinctions when making these decisions. On net neutrality generally, Commissioner Pai's view is that it's a solution in search of a problem, that we need to remain focused on facilitating and creating the environment where providers, CCA members, are going to be investing and deploying the infrastructure that really has made the U.S. wireless networks the envy of the world. I think Commissioner Pai said yesterday, I think it's because of the investments that we've seen, which are a direct result of the regulatory environment we've had. Something like 86, 87% of U.S. consumers have access to 4G LTE. In Europe, where they have a very different regulatory model, that's 27%. So I think we need to keep that in mind going forward.
And I agree with what Brendan said, but my boss has also argued that he does not feel that we have statutory authority in this area in the first place. So we wouldn't have statutory authority over wireline. We wouldn't have it over wireless net neutrality either.
Does your boss think that Howard Buskirk has statutory authority? Or is that not,
Over what?
Over really not even himself. Do you have some other questions? No, I'm sorry, you can't. We have to move on. This is very busy. I have more questions, but I just wanted to give anyone else. David mentioned FCC process reform. Commissioner O'Reilly has proposed something where when an item circulates to commissioners for an agenda meeting, that text of that draft item should be released publicly so the public can weigh in before the meeting. I wanted to get your views, any other views of any of the other folks here on the panel to that proposal, particularly Renee.
Sure. As David mentioned, the Chairman has made process reform one of his priorities since day one, since tasking Diane Cornell with that very unenviable task. And she's done a fantastic job of creating a report based on crowdsourcing from inside the agency as well as outside of the agency, and we're moving forward. Some things have already gotten done, some things are easier to do in short time frames, other things will take a little bit longer. So to the extent that commissioners or anyone else continue to have creative ideas about how we can improve our processes, we want to hear all of them. So I think it's great that commissioners are thinking creatively about how we can improve our own internal processes. And I expect that the chairman's dedication to continually reviewing all of our processes will continue.
So he favors the proposal and will push the commission.
You put words in my mouth.
Okay, well, I'll do what anyone else?
I mean, certainly my bosses had something similar in their process reform proposals. We think more transparency at the FCC is certainly a good thing. I can only take the experience we have in energy and commerce. If we are going to mark up a bill, which is essentially the process the 8th floor goes through when they put something on circulation, it's essentially a modified markup. We have to put it out publicly 48 hours in advance of the markup, and then we have to hold our markup in public. So we are certainly for the FCC providing more access to the public to the decision-making process.
Wanted to ask kind of a general question. Are there any sleeper issues or other things that I have not discussed that you wanted to mention that your bosses want folks to know about here? No?
I'll take the cop out. I mean, we're doing COM Act update, which is pretty comprehensive. Yeah. So it's hard to say that there's a sleeper issue that wouldn't be encompassed by that, but right. There's a lot going to be involved in the COM Act update, a lot. And so to the extent that others have sleeper issues that they'd like to raise with us, we'd love to hear them.
Mm-hmm.
I think when it comes to wireless, there's no such thing as a sleeper issue. It's such
unless you're asleep.
Exactly. It's such an exciting area with all of the innovation that's going on, all of the advances in technology. And as I said at the beginning, it's a really exciting time to be in wireless. And if I tried to tick off all of the other issues that my colleagues and I are dealing with on an everyday basis at the Commission, we'd be here much longer than that little clock tells me that we have.
I just noticed it. Actually, I was looking at my watch. That's quite helpful.
I know.
Not that it's a sleeper issue in any way, shape, or form, but the first thing my boss asked me when I came up to work for him was, what can we do about infrastructure, and where is the infrastructure item? So that is one thing my boss has been very outspoken about, and it really wants to move, with the small cells going towards 3.5, 5 gigahertz. These companies are going to have to be able to build out. So that's one of the things that he's looking into.
Brendan, your boss is also very vocal on that particular item.
Yes.
Yes, he is. He's very vocal. Wanted to give one last chance to folks in the audience. We have a question right up front here.
I think we want to hear from everyone, from all of you, and recognize that for a lot of you who don't have huge Washington offices, it might be intimidating, but don't be intimidating. Our office has an open door policy, and I know the same is true of all of the other commissioners. We want to hear from you. We want to hear your stories. We want to hear what's going on outside of the bubble of the Beltway. And we want stories and anecdotes, yes, but we also want data. We do expect from everyone real data to back up the policy points that you're trying to make. And the more people who are contributing data and information and submitting papers, even if you can't come to DC and meet with folks, the better. The more that there's a dialogue in the industry with the Commission, I think the better it is for everyone.
I'll second that. My boss loves data and studies. He loves learning about, the next wave of technologies. So, that's always effective. Where do we go from here? Forward looking, thinking down the road, not just trying to react to, the latest, thing that we have to deal with at that moment, but trying to come up with a game plan going forward is always very interesting to him. And, as Renee said, mere allegations are not always very helpful. We love hearing your stories. We love hearing about what you are experiencing. But to the extent that you can back that up with cold facts, that is the best way, I think, to approach the commission.
I'll just reiterate one more time something that Commissioner Clyburn closed with, and that is data on mobility fund. We really need to understand, she's really interested in understanding what is the right size of the fund. And she was a big proponent of ensuring that we had the right size back in 2011 when that order was first adopted. And she wants to ensure that going forward that the size is the right amount to promote competitive service in rural areas. And with regard to the T-Mobile roaming petition, Chairman Wheeler made an interesting point a couple of days ago about, showing us some information about what, and we understand that there's confidentiality that cloaks a lot of these negotiations and agreements, but it may be very, very helpful to the staff to actually see complaints and to see specifics about the difficulties that smaller carriers and others are having in obtaining data roaming agreements.
This light is blinking, so I think there may be an explosion. So please help me in thanking our panelists.
We have one more panel, and thank you for our distinguished guests here, Renee, Erin, Louis, Brendan, the beardless one, and David. We finally got. Thank you so very much, and thank you, Paul, for such a great job at moderating, with hecklers not included. Okay, next up is our